Hey, how's it going, everybody? Welcome back to the 21st Talks podcast. My name is Coleman. Welcome to episode 10. Today, me and my co-host Marshall Casebeer are talking to the wonderful Dr. Professor Seth Weinburger from the University of Puget Sound. Seth is a whole lot of fun to talk to. The conversation was just about an hour long, and we touched on some really important points considering questions of political violence. Seth is an expert in defense, in national security, in international politics, and in American history, as well as in notions of sovereignty for states. He knows a lot about political violence, and it was a fantastic time talking to him. Before we jump into the discussion, I need to point out one thing, which is that this is the first of many discussions that we at 21st Talks are going to be having with political experts about political violence. It's a really important political question to get right, whether or not to participate in political violence, whether or not to shun it, how to respond to it, what it means to humans, to us in the 21st century, and whether or not it has a place in the politics that are going to guide us to the best place at the end of this century. We have a whole lot of challenges that we're facing this century as a species and as societies, and we really need to get the question of political violence right before shit starts to hit the fan with all of those. So please buckle in. It's a really fun discussion, and without any further ado, thank you guys very much for listening, and here's episode 10 of the 21st Talks podcast with me, Coleman Snell, and my wonderful co-host, Marshall Casebeer, for this episode. I will see you guys next week. What are the forces, challenges, and ideas that define the 21st century? Conversations to understand the greatest figures and stories of today to create a better tomorrow. This is the 21st Talks podcast. Heck yeah. Okay, sweet. And then what we want to do is me and Marshall just have a couple questions for you relating to political violence and that entire realm of kind of political action and sort of like contemporary notions of it. But the first big thing we were curious about is what is your specific research on? Because we're both really curious how it connects or if it does.
So what I am starting to look at, and it's sort of changed because for a variety of reasons, COVID included, but some other stuff, it's taken me a little bit longer to get it started. So it initially started, I was really interested. So I teach the best way to describe it, I think, is sort of describe how it evolved, because that's the only way that it really makes sense. I was doing work on constitutional law of war powers, and I was writing about war powers questions. I wrote a paper, and so one of the questions is, when can the president use force? And one of the major issues during the Obama administration was the use of drones to eliminate American citizens who were suspected of being members of Al Qaeda. Right. And so, for example, President Obama had Anwar al-Awlaki killed. He was an American citizen. He was a propagandist for Al Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, and President Obama took him out with a drone strike. And this was pretty controversial. This is an American citizen, right, who has now been killed without due process. And so the question was, is that legal? And so I wrote a paper about this, and I argued that I think it is legal. But that it poses problems. And the problem that it poses is as insurgent groups or terrorist groups decentralize, it becomes less clear who is in fact a member of a group like Al Qaeda, right? Now, I think it was pretty clear that there were no serious doubts that al-Awlaki was a member of Al Qaeda, right? Mm-hmm. But for example, I'll just give you an example. There was this guy named Nidal Hassan, who was a major in the U.S. Army. He's the guy who shot up Fort Hood. I don't know if you know about this. Mm-hmm. Maybe 10 years ago now. I don't remember exactly when it was, right? So, he never joined an organization. He got radicalized online. And one morning, I'm going to simplify this. I don't exactly know how his decision process worked, right? But the only thing that made him a member of Al Qaeda was when he walked into his military base and shot a bunch of people, right? So the question then became, what I was writing about is, it's pretty clear that once you become a member of a terrorist organization, you would lose your constitutional rights, right? And you become an enemy and you can be killed, like in a war, right?
Mm.
The question is, when do you actually become a member of the enemy? And so this got me to start thinking about what constitutes membership in a decentralized group that's not actually like holding meetings and giving you ID cards and stuff like this, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I started thinking about a group, the incels, right? Because I suspected that they were sort of an extreme version of this, right? There's no group of incels, right? There are a bunch of people who hang out online and talk about how much they hate women and how much they want to have sex, right? Some of them decide to go kill people, right? Largely they go to the straight. So there have been two major incel, or at least two. There was a guy, I don't know, 10 years ago who shot up sororities in California, massacred a bunch of college students. He was an incel. And then there was a guy just about 2 years ago who drove over a bunch of people in Canada with a truck. And so I was really interested in sort of how people sort of decide and become sort of part of a group, how that, and sort of how we would think about that legally, right? Because it affects their status and it affects the kinds of tools that the government can use against them. That led me to start thinking about sort of broader questions of white supremacist, white nationalist violence, because I think they are using similar models, right? So what they're doing is pushing ideology out on the internet, and people sort of become self-radicalized, right? So people refer to this as the lone wolf phenomenon, but that's actually a bad way to think about it, because they're not entirely lone wolves, right? They are sort of connected to this broader network because they are online, they're in chat rooms, they're reading manifestos, right? They're reading. And so, one of the things you'll notice is that when these people commit murders, like the guy who shot up the Christchurch Mosque, right? He had read the manifesto of Dylan Roof, the guy who shot up the Charleston church, right? So they're reading each other's stuff. They're becoming radicalized in similar ways. And so what I'm interested in is, how does this actually work, right? How do people basically who are swimming in this sea of shit, right? Who are conspiracy theories, radical white supremacist ideologies, sort of how do we think about what it means for them to become terrorists or insurgents, right? Is it only the moment that they commit acts of violence, stuff that, so that's sort of what I'm thinking about. And so, so I'm doing research into how do ideologies, sort of like religion as an analogy, but religion, conspiratorial belief, how do these things actually motivate people to violence? Because what we need to think about is sort of what's the moment, right? I mean, at some point, in theory, you go from being a sort of a private citizen, and that's not the right word. You go from being a normal person to being a violent insurgent, right?
Exactly.
And that's an important line. And if it's only, right, so in the Nidal Hassan example, if it's only the moment at which you're actually shooting people, then there's not much you can do. And that might be the answer. The answer might just be that given our constitutional protections, right, there's really nothing you can do because someone is out there reading stuff on the line and you can't do anything about it until they actually commit an act of violence, right? But it's also possible that it allows you to rethink what is going on the internet in ways, and to think about, sort of racketeering and conspiracy theory. I mean, I don't know that side of the law, but so that's sort of what I'm thinking about, and that's where I'm thinking about going.
Oh, there's so many directions we can go with that. Do you have any questions, Marshall, that are standing out right now?
Yeah, I do have a couple. So I'm part of what I am thinking about when I'm looking at this, like this political violence work that we're trying to do, is like the discrepancy between ideological commitments and violent actions. And I'm kind of wondering how you see, like, because it sounds to me like the kind of like groups or individuals you're working with and like radicalization, there isn't that kind of discrepancy. It's kind of like violence guided by ideological commitments. And I guess I'm wondering, like, is that a distinction that is important to identifying someone as a terrorist or like a radical, or is like...
What do you mean by discrepancy? What are you thinking about there?
So, I mean, we had an experience in which we were at an event where I read a pamphlet that was handed out by the Sprout Anarchist Collective. It was like essentially a description of like anarchist philosophy and like praxis, and in it talked about like the cognizant, conscious use of violence to accomplish ends. And then 20 minutes later, they were trying to break a, like a Honda Civic's windshield with a crowbar. And like that discrepancy between like the ideological commitment to use violence for a concrete defined end, and then the use of violence for what I can discern no other reason than for the joy of violence.
Okay.
Like that discrepancy right there.
So in your assessment, the attempt to break the car's window did not meet with the sort of the ideological purpose that they had described in their pamphlet. Is that what you're arguing?
Yes.
Okay. So that's not something that I'm necessarily thinking about, right? But I mean, I think we know a few things about the ways in which people think about violence, right? Once you accept violence as a tool, it becomes a normalized thing in your toolbox, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if you think about all the kind of buffers that exist in people's minds, right? Why we don't use violence as a tool, right? Once you sort of accept that violence is a legitimate option, then I think it normalizes it for you, right? So somebody who sees, so I would bet that the person who's breaking that car window has rationalized that violence in the logic of the pamphlet, even if you, as an observer, disagree. I'm going to guess that person thinks that what they're doing is smashing the patriarchy, smashing capitalism, smashing this, punishing this capitalist who buys a car, whatever it is, right? Because they've already made that commitment. They already see violence as a viable tool. They've sort of defined a set of targets against whom violence can be used, right? So one of the differences, my wife often jokes that I talk about, people who deserve to be punched for things, right? Asshole, so, but that's not I don't have a philosophic commitment behind people who need to be punched, right? Someone is an asshole on TV and you're like, that guy should be punched, right? Bullies, right? Someone who bullies somebody, right? I have no problem if that person gets punched, right? But that's not an ideological commitment to violence, right? So once you make an ideological commitment to violence, right? So once you are an anarchist, for example, and you say, right, violence is a legitimate tool against capitalist government or whatever, right? Then the only question is, how do you define the legitimate target, right? You've already defined violence into your political toolbox, right? So now, again, as I said, you think that the Honda Civic is not, and I'm not saying you agreed with the pamphlet, right? But even if you did agree with the pamphlet, or even if you're assessing the logic of the pamphlet, your argument is that the Honda Civic is not a legitimate target. But the person who's bashing the window in clearly seems to think it is, right? So again, sort of once you develop an ideological commitment to violence, and then you can see this with Al Qaeda, right? So you sort of look the ways in which so there was a very famous interview with Osama bin Laden after September 11th, in which someone asked him, what about all the Muslims you killed, right? There were, I don't remember the number, but there were a lot of Muslims, right? And, he basically said, well, they're living in the West, so they're legitimate targets, right? Again, a kind of justification, a rationalization, because you've already made that ideological commitment. And then the only question becomes, who are the legitimate targets of your violence, right?
And then as human beings, we're very, very good at just rationalizing action that's actually predicated on emotion, right?
Yeah, we can
and because of that,
anything we want. Yeah.
Which is, I think, one of the reasons why, because there's so many directions we can take, and some of the other questions we have are about how political violence has, like, how the shape it takes now is distinctly different than the shape it's taken historically, and what that means for sort of adherence to sort of violent ideologies. But before getting to those, I think the question of a legitimate target is just an expression of rationalization within groups of people, where it's like, it's one of the most likely responses to someone smashing a window is someone else going, oh, that person seems like they're hurting, or like, oh, that person seems really satisfied with the system. They feel beaten down, and that's how they're sort of finding a voice, is through these like expressions of property damage, right?
Right.
And I think that because that's such a common response that I hear from people around my age range who have experienced political violence or property damage at different protests and stuff in the summer, it seems like it feels really apt for me to see it as all just kind of like a rationalization, that like it doesn't matter who the legitimate target is ideologically, because they'll just expand the circle of legitimate target to whatever suits their emotional desire.
So let me see if I can pull something in here. So I'm thinking of a couple of things. I mean, so first of all, so first of all, Socrates, Aristotle, they all tell us, right? I mean, everyone thinks that what they're doing is good, right? So everybody thinks that their own understanding of targets is good. So, I teach American political thought, and in American political thought, we read about the Nullification Crisis, right? So the Nullification Crisis is a precursor to the Civil War. The United States passes a tariff, and South Carolina believes that the tariff is directed at destroying basically the Southern economy. So South Carolina, this is in 1828, I think. Andrew Jackson's the president. And South Carolina declares that South Carolina has the right to nullify unconstitutional federal laws. Okay, and so they claim that the tariff is unconstitutional and that they are going to nullify it. Right. So this is sort of a test of the logic of secession, right? That states can basically decide when the federal government is behaving unconstitutionally and just, right. Okay. So Jackson writes this very long response. And one of the things and there's a really interesting, let me see if I can read this, pull this up here. Because I want to there's a really interesting quote. What do I need? Oh, crap. What's the best way to find this? All right, hold on. Give me 1 second here. Right. So what he basically argues is that you can't, right? So the question is and it's part of a larger question in American politics, which is, when do people have a right to reject their government or revolt or use violence, right? And it's, so that's a legitimate right. When do we think that we can actually, smash the system? Okay, so that's an important question. All right, come here. Okay, and so what he says is, he basically argues that the right to revolution is really complicated, because there clearly is a right to revolution, but it can't be, well, all right, it'll just be easier if I just find this quote here, if I find this stuff.
Right to revolution, that's an interesting idea.
So what he says is that basically the problem with what South Carolina is doing is that if you, and this comes out of Hobbes too, right? If you choose to revolt, the government is going to kill you, right? Or the government is going to try to kill you, because the government has the right to hold itself together, right? So you can't talk about a right to revolt. You have the ability to revolt. And if you do it, you have to accept the consequences, that there is a good likelihood that you are going to be killed, right? Because the government is going to use force against you. And so the problem is that people who talk about a right to revolt are improperly lowering the bar and making people think that it's too easy to revolt, and therefore they don't actually understand the consequences of what's going to happen to them when they do this, right?
That's such an interesting idea.
All right, so I don't have my marked up copy here. Let's see if I'm gonna have to find this. Here we go. Okay, here it is, right? For what do you throw away these inestimable blessings? For what would you exchange your share in the advantages and honor of the Union? For the dream of a separate independence, a dream interrupted, blah, 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 right? If your leader could succeed in establishing a separation, what would be your situation? Okay, now, the laws, right? But the dictates of a high duty oblige me solemnly to announce that you cannot succeed. The laws of the United States must be executed. I have no discretionary power on this subject. My duty is emphatically pronounced in the Constitution. Those who told you that you might peaceably prevent their execution deceived you. They could not have been deceived themselves. They know that a forcible opposition could alone prevent the execution of the laws, and they know that some such opposition must be repelled. Their object is disunion, but be not deceived by names. Disunion by armed forces, treason. Are you really ready to incur its guilt? If you are, on the head of the instigators of the act be the dreadful consequences. On their heads be the dishonor, but on yours may the punishment fall. On your unhappy state will inevitably fail all the evils of the conflict you force upon the government of your country. It cannot exceed to the mad project of disunion, of which you will be its first victims. And so what he's saying is, if you want to use violence against the state, right, you have to do so full knowing, right? Do not pretend that you have a right to do this. Do not pretend that it's going to be fine, right? If you do this, know that the state is going to come after you and destroy, right? And that's, of course, exactly what happens in the Civil War, right? The South says, well, we can just leave. And the North says, no, you can't. And we're going to kill you. And we're not going to allow you to do this, right? So, and this connects to my point about Socrates and Aristotle, right? The reason we don't let people make their own decisions about the enforcement of the law is because people, of course, can't make judgments in their own cases, right? And this is what Locke tells us gets us out of the state of nature, right? We love ourselves. We think that we're right. And so we can't be the judges in our own case, right? So the guy who's smashing the window of the Honda is being a judge in his own case, right? He is deciding now everybody has the ability to do that, right? Anybody at any point can say, hey, I'm going to do whatever I want to. But when you do that, right? When you do that, you are now basically asking the state to destroy you, because you are moving yourself outside of the contract, outside of the social compact, right? And so I think, and so what Jackson is saying is that you can't just sort of hand out pamphlets saying, hey, go smash the capitalist system. Because if you do that, the cops are going to show up and smash you, right? Now, I mean, this is not in the context, I'm not raising this in the context of whether or not the response to Black Lives Matter or the storming of the Capitol was legitimate, right? Yeah. Jackson's point is, though, that when you ask people to use violence, right? If you ask people to use violence, you are asking them to betray the contract that they have with their government. And there is only one possible response from the government when you do that, which is violence. And so you can't just say things like trust your own conscience and do whatever you want and smash the capitalism. And because when you do that, what Jackson is concerned about is that when you do that, you're making it seem like you just have a right to do whatever you want, that you have the right to judge things, and that you can just make those assessments. And there's somewhere else where he talks about that too. Here it is. Okay. Okay. Mark, my fellow citizens, that by the admissions of your own leaders, the unconstitutionality, so here he's referring to what South Carolina is claiming they have the right to nullify, this tax, this tariff, okay? That the unconstitutionality must be palpable, or it will not justify either resistance or nullification. What is the meaning of the word palpable? That which is apparent to everyone, that which no man of ordinary intellect will fail to perceive. Is the unconstitutionality of these laws of that description? Let those among your leaders who once approved and advocated the principles of protective duties answer the question. And right, in any case, they are unsafe guides in the perilous path they urge you to tread. Ponder well on this, and you will know how to appreciate the exaggerated language they address to you, right? So what he's saying is, he's saying you can't trust these people because they are suggesting that what they're telling you to do, they're not really explaining to you the consequences, right? Everything that you don't like can't possibly be something that justifies violence, right? Because you are a bad judge of your own stuff, right? Because you are a bad judge in your own cases, right? So you, an individual, right? And this actually even goes back to Hobbes, right? Hobbes, I think, makes a really compelling argument, at least the way that I read Hobbes, right? Hobbes basically repeatedly says you can't violate the contract, right? You can't rebel against your government. But I think if you read Hobbes carefully, what he really says is, however, the government also has a possibility to prevent you from rebelling, right? Because if you are so distressed that you believe the return to the state of nature is justified, then the government itself has failed. It's created a community that you do not, right? So what all this is doing, it's saying that there's a really complicated calculation, right, that people have to make. And the calculation is, when are things so unbearable that I really do have to use violence against the system, right? And the problem is that you can't just go around telling people that they should just be their own judge, right?
Yeah.
And one of the ways and so what Jackson ultimately says here, and I think what Hobbes tells us, and what Lincoln says too, is that the only way to know is that when people are really willing to die, right? Right. The only way you know when people really are in a situation where the oppression is palpable is not where they risk death, but where they're willing to die. And those are two different things, right? Where you say, hey, I know that what I'm doing is going to be met by force, right? So, for example, the difference is, I think if you look at, the civil rights movement, they knew that they knew that civil disobedience, right, breaking the law, right, was going to be met by force. And they took that on themselves. And in fact, Martin Luther King describes the process that you're supposed to go through to do this kind of resistance, right? You have to prepare yourself for it because you know it's coming, right? But in South Carolina, right, in the storming of the Capitol, in the anarchists at the protest, right, they're not telling people to prepare. They're just saying, just go smash shit.
Yeah.
Right. And that's the problem, right? When you lower the bar so that everyone just becomes a judge of their own oppression and gets to use violence to speak out, then you've got yourself a real problem. And that's, I think, Marshall, where that discrepancy comes in, right? Where people now just say, oh, hey, I'm oppressed by this rich guy's Honda Civic and I'm going to smash it.
Or even this like working class individuals like Honda Civic which I think is the frustrating thing for a lot of people, especially who occupy spaces on the left or more like socialist leaning, more like working class struggle focused, is you see people damaging like the property and like the livelihoods of other working class folks in a means that doesn't actually take effective action because of the Hobbesian inability to be a good judge of your own stuff.
That's Locke.
Oh, sorry, Locke. Okay, Lockean. I think one of my big questions here now is like how does that stand up when there's such a large, like, I mean, when there's like empirically based evidence to show like systematic failures of the state that like lead to oppressive conditions? Because I think that the social the social contract theory, right, is like predicated off of protection from the state, right? Isn't it? It's not exactly the responsibility to protect, but it is predicated off of that. So if an individual or groups of individuals come together and say, okay, like historically, I as an individual, but also my community have been deprived of these things, then naturally it seems like a rejection of the social contract is, I mean, it's almost like the social contract wasn't ever actually written. And if it was, it was with a gun to your head,
Right. Well, I mean, so think about the Declaration, right? The Declaration of Independence is a statement of people who say, right, our social contract is unjust and invalid, and we are announcing our intention to remove ourselves from it, right? And then those people risk death, right? They go out and they fight a war, right?
Yeah.
So that's right. So if I mean, if I'm understanding you, right? I mean, do I think that Black Americans would be justified in saying, the social contract, I don't know about now, but that's a more complicated question, but certainly in the 50s or 60s, would they have been justified saying, this social contract is unjust and we're going to revolt? Yeah, of course, right? There was such obvious manifest oppression, right? That was palpable, right? And that's Malcolm X's position, right? By any means necessary, right? And he lost that sort of debate for the Black community, and Martin Luther King wins it, and they go about peaceful nonviolence. But would it have been justified? Sure. But would the state have been justified in responding? Again, the answer is yes, because that's how states work, right?
Wow, that's so far out the peer review, is that the right word? Anyways, it's really outside the scope of sort of contemporary sort of political discourse on the left, right? Which is why it's so interesting to me is I haven't ever really thought about like what is justified from the state standpoint, and in your sovereignty classes has got me thinking about that. And I think that like there's still kind of like a human element here that I kind of feel like I don't know. I believe in MLK's like idea that like what is it, like riots are the voice of the unheard or something to that effect, right?
Yep.
And I definitely think that like a question I have for you that's a bit tangential is when we go to define violence, are we defining violence on the basis of just violence against another body or another individual, or are we also counting property damage? Because I think that that's a really big difference here is how we treat property damage versus like violence against like individuals and stuff, and like threats of death and that sort of stuff and assaults, because I think that's an incredibly important distinction to take there.
Yeah.
So I'd be interested to hear both of you guys' thoughts on where that line is for you, because I keep using the terms interchangeably and then not interchangeably, and I really need to define my terms here.
Yeah, I mean, that's something that I haven't really sort of thought about systematically. I mean, my gut is that of course there's a difference, and there is a difference between violence that is aimed at property and violence that is aimed at individuals. But
sure.
I haven't thought about that in any kind of systematic way.
Marshall, do you have any nice distinction there that you've kind of delineated? Okay.
No, it is kind of killing me. Seth, I do have another question. I recently read a piece that Professor Kessel pointed me in the direction of about a colleague of hers is working on a just riot theory project, which is crazy interesting. But she pointed me in the direction that was just kind of like this normative defense of rioting, and it's like primarily its efficacy. But I'm interested because like the kind of justified response you're talking about on behalf of the government, we don't see that as much.
Let me just clarify. I mean, justified in the sense that a state has the right to defend itself, not morally justified, right? The state,
right.
The state can still the state's sort of legally justified response can still be morally, abhorrent.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah. So this is political, not moral.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I guess we have become like sometimes it occurs where the kind of justification that like a state can legally defend itself, it doesn't. And I'm curious as to if that's like.
Say that again, Marshall.
Sometimes the state doesn't. Sometimes the state doesn't like act with all of its tools in order to suppress like. And I'm wondering if like you think that's primarily like a political calculus, if that is like why does that happen and what is its effect when it does?
So that's really interesting, right? It's a really interesting phenomenon that you can think about in the context of the end of the Cold War, right? When the end of the Cold War is happening, right? When pro-democracy, anti-communist movements are emerging in Poland and Romania and and Czechoslovakia and those places, right? The question was always going to be, well, how is the state going to respond? Is the state just going to come and smash these people like it has done in the past, right? Where you send in the troops and you just beat everyone down, right? Like Tiananmen Square, right? In 19, right? Where China just said, we're just going to slaughter everybody, okay? That's not what happens in 1989, right? All those East European regimes, they don't use violence, right? Well, okay, so why not? This isn't something that I study. I've read about it, but I wouldn't say I study it, right? But the basic argument seems to be this, right? The people who are going to do the smashing are still people, right? They have wives and husbands and children, and they have friends, and they have to believe that what they're doing is right, and they have to be willing to live with what they've done. And they have to be willing, to look at their neighbors and all these sorts of things, right? And so partly this depends on the ability of the regime to convince the security forces that what they're doing is legitimate, right? And is in the interest not just of the state, but of the nation, right? Of the political body, right? And so there are different kinds of cases, right? There are some times where the government basically just says, well, there's no way we're going to do this, right? Or the amount of force that it's going to take is going to be so high that we can't possibly, that our soldiers won't do it, or, we can't survive or whatever. And so they don't do it. And then so there are moments at which, and that's sort of the logic, that's at least when riots get to that or protests get to that level, that's sort of the logic, right? Is they are So crap. Let me. This is such a simple drawing. It's sort of ridiculous to open up my whiteboard for this, but it's a useful way to think about things.
For sure. I'm always excited when he gets the whiteboard out, because like having a visual diagram helps so much.
This is, like I said, this is going to be really simple, but okay. So all regimes, right, operate on a continuum of let's say legitimacy is here and coercion is here, right? All regimes are somewhere on this continuum, right? All regimes operate with a mix of legitimacy and coercion, right? So most of us, right, we accept that the laws that which we operate under are legitimate, but we also know, right, so, a liberal democracy is going to be somewhere, and, this is not to scale or official or anything, right? Liberal democracies are going to be somewhere at this end of the scale, right? We basically accept that our government is legitimate, that the laws that we follow are legitimate, but we also know that there's coercion out there and that it's going to fall on our heads if we break the law, right? North Korea is down here, right? China is probably somewhere here, right? All regimes are a mix of legitimacy and coercion. What large-scale protests or riots do is they force a state to go this way, right? The state is going to increasingly have to rely on coercion in order to hold itself together. For every state, there is some sort of threshold at which it cannot use that much coercion, right? Or which it decides that it is not willing to use that much coercion, right? So and sometimes that comes from the soldiers, right? So sometimes the police just say, "Hey, we're just not going to do what you're asking us to," right? These are my my fellow citizens. These are my neighbors. These are my friends. I'm not going to beat them with my club. I'm not going to shoot them, right? So the amount of coercion that the state demands to hold on to power, the state can actually not manifest, because the people who through whom that coercion gets channeled will not do it. Sometimes the state decides, right? So in Tiananmen Square, right, China, is pushed all the way here, and it just slaughters, right? Most people estimate that China killed 10,000 people at Tiananmen Square. We don't really know, but thousands and thousands of people they were willing to kill to hold on to power, right? If you look at what's going on in Hong Kong now, right? People in Hong Kong are trying to force this question, right? They are trying to raise the level of coercion that China is going to have to use to hold on to Hong Kong in the way that China wants, and hope that China won't actually do it, right? And the question is, will China eventually use the kind of violence that's required? I don't know. The social media scene is different, so they might not. They might not be willing to slaughter all these people, but this is what's going on, right? This is what happens when people protest the state in a mass way, right? They are challenging the state they are requiring the state to increase the amount of coercion that the state is going to use in order to hold on to power. And the game, and so again, this is sort of what Jackson was talking about, right? If you do this, the state has to respond with coercion. And so you have to know what you're doing. When you're getting people to protest or to riot, when you are pushing this arrow, you have to understand what you're actually doing, because what you're going to do is force the state to rely on coercion, right?
Yeah.
And that's why you have to be honest. And that's why people have to understand what it is that they're doing. And you can't just say, "Oh, you have a right to do this," because you don't have a right to do it. You might be able to do it, but you don't have a right to do it.
I think that's one of the ways that contemporary political violence changes, is that push towards coercion, because people can capture it and there's a social media landscape now. Yep. It puts states, like, I'm sure the sort of power infrastructure of China right now is probably freaking out about Hong Kong, because they recognize that it's not realistic to be able to suppress in the same way that they suppressed the Tiananmen Square.
Yeah, that's right. They just can't do it.
And I think because of that, like, I can't say any names, unfortunately, for their safety, but like I have some friends who are in Hong Kong and have been a part of the protests. I have some friends from Wuhan who are involved in some of the communities I'm a part of, and talking with them about the sort of state crackdowns, like the fact that they're communicating to a foreigner puts them on a list.
Yeah.
Right.
Sure.
So there's all these sort of like mechanisms that the state's trying to use to be able to leverage in sort of like take control over like social media and sort of like internet landscapes, like the Great Firewall of China, right? But there's also sort of further coercion through the social merit system and all these other things that China's currently trying to participate in. And it seems like it's all just sort of a 21st, like it's a balance, right? You have like the benefits that cause states to not be able to be as coercive openly, right? But then there's also an entirely different sort of technological form of coercion that's now actually possible and viable. I think one of the big questions that I have going forward politically is like, how are those going to hash out? Will the force of social media and the entire world be able to see what a state does? Will that outweigh the incentive that states have to be incredibly manipulative and coercive using technology?
Yeah, I'm sure there are people who are studying that.
Oh, I'm sure. Yeah, I think that's a super interesting political discussion that I'll have on at some point, I'm sure. But yeah, Marshall, were you going to say something?
I mean, just for my own sake. So the efficacy of political violence is essentially a function of like the scale of resistance and the degree of coercion the state is willing to use
or capable of using. Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, willing in the sense that and the only reason I make the distinction is because there are times where the state is willing, but the police officers are not. So it depends. Like, does that mean the state's not willing or not capable? But you could define that either way. But there are times where the state calls on its police or its soldiers to use coercion, and they will not.
Yeah.
So, but yes, I think that's kind of the argument I'm making here. When you're talking about large scale, anti-systemic political violence or protest, yes, this is what you are doing, right? Yeah, no, there's other kinds of protests, right? So peaceful protest is designed to call in to question the legitimacy, right? So if what you're, but even what Martin Luther King was doing, right? One of the things that he knew he was going to do, right, was force the state to increase coercion, right? And what that does, right? What that did is it forced white Americans to say, it's one thing to sort of believe that separate but equal is, fine. It's another thing to actually see someone get beaten for sitting at a lunch counter, right?
Yeah.
And, that was on TV too. I mean, it wasn't social media the way it is here, right? But that was on TV, and people, getting attacked by dogs, and that forced white Americans to see, to sort of expose the hypocrisy, right? I mean, what are these people getting beaten for sitting on a bus? And it's not that people didn't know the consequences of separate but equal, right? But to raise the level of coercion and what you see is that people are being punished and beaten for these things. That's exactly what it does, right? So when you're protesting at that level, I think this is a nice model way to think about what you're trying to do.
Which in that case would be the effectiveness of peaceful protests is it wins the hearts and mind like war, right? And then on top of that, it also highlights the contradictions, which is going to be present, not only any form of like human sort of like ideation or sort of ideological structures, but also especially political structures.
Right.
So it highlights the sort of ethical and humanitarian concerns while not exacerbating the state's coercion so far that it essentially collapses. Because I think that's one of the concerns of like existential risk right now is like, we're starting to enter a phase now where there's a lot of interesting and quite terrifying research papers by people like Nick Bostrom and other thinkers in the field that talk about this idea of the democratization of destruction, right? And a lot of times when we talk about these sort of like not so lone wolf terrorists, right? Or political actors, we're talking about people who can take out like 10, 20 and upwards of like maybe 100 people at particularly incredibly tragic events. But we're starting to move to a point where technologically, given some level of expertise in the next 15 to 20 years, it won't be unreasonable for someone to be able to genetically modify a current strain of a virus and just be able to expose it to people, right? So there's going to be this massive increase in an individual's ability to cause widespread havoc. Imagine, a good example is imagine if nuclear weapons, you can make one by putting some sand, some metal, and some glass into a microwave. Imagine if it was that easy to make a nuclear weapon, where we're entering a phase where our luck is about to run out on how easy it is to cause widespread destruction. So I think my question is will the states have to preemptively become more coercive to be able to stop events like that from happening, which could, like, one or two of these not so lone wolf attacks could be incredibly destructive if the bioterrorism threat, and I think that's like, it's a matter of time until a state has to deal with that. And something that I haven't really seen the Defense Department really like try to tackle.
Oh, I assure you that they are. I mean, I was peripherally involved with work on that way back a long time ago before I became a professor. When I was doing wargaming, and they were thinking about. So they are thinking about stuff like that.
Okay.
I mean, the one thing I will say is that, yes, technology is progressing, but things tend to never be quite as bad as the worst case scenarios assume they're going to be. Now that doesn't mean genetic modification has been around for a while. It is. How long ago was this? I know a long time. There was a big controversy because somebody basically discovered how to manipulate mouse pox to make it. And there was a big question as to whether or not this research should be published, because it had to do with also vaccines against AIDS and smallpox and stuff like that.
For sure.
And there was the Defense Department didn't want it to be published because they thought it would do exactly what you're doing, make it too easy for someone to learn how to manipulate a virus. It is a real possibility. But yeah, they are thinking about it, but that doesn't mean that they're going to do it right.
Yeah. Getting anywhere near close to getting it right, because I mean, it's the same issue with like the dirty bomb question, right? Is like, we know that there's a certain amount of nuclear material that's missing due to the collapse of the USSR, and other sort of like mishandling of nuclear material historically, and we don't have it all accounted for, right? Yeah. And like stuff like that, where it creates conditions where a potential like dirty bomb being released in a city center, and events like that, I'm sure it's on the purview of the Defense Department, other sort of like bodies that have to ask about these things. But I just think that it's really important when it comes to this question of coercion, because it's the upper limit of potential political violence, right? And then a lot of what Marshall and I are really interested in is like the sort of like more like I don't want to say traditional forms of political violence, but the more common in any populist movements or any movements that have to do with like societal upheaval, right? Because I think the two are connected. I think the two are absolutely connected.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
I mean, to that, like this equation up on the whiteboard, is that fundamentally changed by individuals' capacity, or not capacity, kind of capacity, ability to inflict damage?
Yeah, I think that was sort of Coleman's point, right? I mean, if individual citizens can create weapons of mass destruction in their basements, a virus, if somebody could create smallpox in their basement and release it, or genetically targeted things, right? That requires higher levels of coercion, right? I mean, how much, it's hard to say, but yeah, but it also goes both ways, right? Because one of the things that has happened, of course, is that as information increases, that also requires more legitimacy, right? So, so one of the interesting things is that as it goes both ways, right? As the threat to the state becomes bigger. So if you look at the evolution of states as political entities, starting really in the 19th century, as the threats to states became bigger, states needed larger militaries, right? Well, as states need larger militaries, that actually requires them to have more legitimacy, because they need people to be willing to serve in the military, and they need and they need those people to be well fed, and they need those people to be healthy and things like this. And so so it goes both ways, right? So it's not just that all of a sudden the pendulum swings to coercion, right? Yeah. I mean, yes, it might require a higher level of coercion, but that also, in a way, also emphasizes, especially for a liberal democracy, right? There's also going to be a pull back of legitimacy, right? So it's not just sort of a one-way arrow, right? It's a herky-jerky thing where it goes back and forth, because states require legitimacy even as they are trying to coerce, right? So you could imagine that, you might start here, and then all of a sudden some technology exists which the technology by itself might move the coercion but then the state then requires more legitimacy. So in fact, what happens is you only get maybe, that far, right? Or something like that.
And I mean, this also contributes to questions of social cohesion and sort of like cultural standards. And I think it's a little bit, I think American unrest from just a cultural standpoint is really, really understandable, taking that we're a country founded in the idea of just like revolution and like rejection of like power hierarchies. Of course, you're going to have cultural tendencies that are carried on from that lineage of rebellion. That's going to cause individuals and communities of individuals to reject structures of power, right? Which, I mean, we saw with like situations like Waco, and the individuals, and I think was it like 2014 who took over the spot in like Oregon. And so like these sort of acts of sort of political rebellion, right, I think are deeply American culturally. So it makes sense that like there's going to be this, it makes sense that the social cohesion question, at least within the American context, is not answered as sufficiently to allow for, I don't even know if it's a more subtle form of coercion. Like, I don't know if social cohesion that's supported by the state's like a subtle form of coercion. But it definitely, it feeds to legitimacy, if anything. And I think because of that, like, I think it's something that the American political culture is going to have to reconcile soon, is how do we increase the idea of social cohesion, which is the issue bipartisanship.
Yeah, well, that's Plato's concern back with with the cave and the noble lie, right? Is how do you make people love the state, because they have to love the state. In order for a state to function, people have to love the state, and so the noble lie and the cave are all designed to make people love the state, right? But we have our own, but nobody, or I don't know that nobody, but lots of people question, the American lie, noble lie, the melting pot, the American dream, these things, they're true to a degree, but we're also highly skeptical of them, right? We don't believe that anybody who works hard can make, if you're a poor, black child born in a to a crappy family situation in a poor, you don't have the same opportunity, and we know that, right? So, and it's important that we do puncture those myths, right? It's important that we understand that the American founding is rooted in slavery and genocide. But at the time that we do that, we also have to recognize that we are damaging the social cohesion of the state, which is necessary, right? And so that's a really, and I always make, it, by no means am I saying that we shouldn't, acknowledge what was done to Native Americans, or we shouldn't acknowledge slavery, right? We have to do those things. But doing those things has a cost. Right. And one of the things that has done is has punctured social cohesiveness. Right now, that social cohesiveness was in fact based on lies and white supremacy and all that stuff. So again, I'm not saying, right, but social cohesion is important. Right. And so if you're going to get rid of a crappy version of social cohesion, what are you going to replace it with?
And right? I think that there's absolutely like it's a baby in the bathwater situation, right? Where we have to be able to understand the aspects and sort of like what conditions led to the need for that noble lie, which was based in disgusting ideologies, and sort of like systems of white supremacy.
For Plato, it's that all societies require people to look beyond themselves.
Yeah.
The only way you get people to look beyond themselves is to lie to them about things, right? Because otherwise we're just selfish, right? We are selfish beings and we care about ourselves. And so remember, have you read The Republic, Coleman?
Yeah,
Marshall, have you read The Republic?
Right? Bits and pieces, but
so remember, the noble lie has two parts. First, you tell people that they're born out of the ground, that they're born out of the earth, right? That the place they live is literally their mother, and you do that for two reasons. One, because it makes everybody your family, and we always love our family more than we love other people, right? But it covers up the unjust origins of the state, right? If you were born here, that means that nobody was there before you, right? And we know that no political community, well, I mean, somewhere deep lost in history, right, is the original political community in a particular place, right? But even if we think, I mean, so for example, it is right for Puget Sound to pay acknowledgement to the people whose land, who were here before us, whose land was taken, right? But those weren't the first people who were here, and they probably slaughtered the group of people who were there before they were, because that's what people do, right? So at the same time that we acknowledge the injustice that we have committed, we also shouldn't be deifying the people against whom that injustice was committed, because they probably did exactly the same thing to somebody else, right? Because that's just the way it works, right?
Yeah.
The second part of the noble lie is the myth of the metals, right? So Marshall, you tell everybody that basically everybody has certain metals in their blood, and that determines their job and their role in society, right? And the reason you do this is because if you're supposed to be the shit shoveler, nobody wants to be the shit shoveler, but you need someone to shovel shit. And so the best way to get someone to shovel shit is to tell them that that's what God wants them to do, right? That you were born, that is your destiny, right? And so again, it's a version of, you know, the American dream. If you just work hard, right? And so it does the same thing. It justifies your place in society, right? And so for Plato, if you do these things, now people will believe that their job is to serve the community and not themselves, right? And that's what the melting pot does, and the American dream, and all these things, right? They're about creating a kind of social cohesion. Again, that is all founded on monstrous lies and on genocide. And the point isn't to keep those things, but the point is then, and I do have to go after this, right? So but the point becomes, in the absence of that, what holds the country together, right? What is it that defines America? And I don't know that we have I don't have an answer to that. I don't know what is an answer to that, right? Lincoln's answer was, it has to be values that and so, you know, to some degree, what Lincoln and Martin Luther King believed is that the answer was the understanding of the American ideal as aspiration, not as reality, right? That what makes Americans is a belief in the Declaration of Independence, but as goals, not things that we have actually achieved, right?
I mean, I think regardless of where we're going forward, I think the best answer will probably be found through synthesizing old ways of being and finding the wrong and the right and the right and the wrong. And I think that finding a new noble lie that's ethical and is based on empathy, I think, is essential here.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Yeah, my pleasure.
Yeah, thank you so much for chatting.
Sure.